A powerful earthquake in Morocco has inflicted death and destruction. More than 2,000 people are now known to have died after the quake struck in the high Atlas Mountains, southwest of the city of Marrakech. King Mohammed has called for 3 days of mourning as rescue attempts continue in the areas badly affected by the 6.8 magnitude quake. It's the biggest to hit the country in 120 years.
Mountain villages reduced to rubble. Despite the scale of destruction, survivors are emerging. A resident is pulled from beneath the debris, badly injured but alive, giving rescuers a rare moment to celebrate. The earthquake struck at night, sending people running from their homes or stuck in their beds.
I couldn't escape because the roof fell on me. I was trapped. I was saved by my neighbours who cleared the rubble with their bare hands.
The wounded were treated in makeshift outdoor clinics. Others have received no help at all. This man survived, but his injuries leave his family without an income.
As for food, we have nowhere to cook. We cannot go back home because of the danger of collapse.
Residents are surveying the damage to their homes, many wrecked beyond repair. Buildings teeter on the verge of collapse. Fallen rocks are slowing access to the epicenter in the remote Atlas Mountains.
There are a lot of blocked roads, a lot of people can't find their parents, and a lot of people are still under the rubble. They're still searching for their relatives.
The quake rocked the historic city Marrakech, destroying mosques and shops. Streets, usually busy with tourists, were left lined with rubble. Residents and travelers have been sleeping in streets and parks, afraid of aftershocks.
All our houses are cracked. They could fall down at any moment. That's why we can't go back.
Moroccans are queuing to donate blood to treat the wounded. International assistance is also on the way. Meanwhile, the digging continues, here not for survivors, but for graves, as Morocco buries its thousands of dead.
Let's bring in David Rothery. He's a professor of planetary geosciences at the Open University in the United Kingdom. Hello, David. Thanks a lot for your time. Why was this earthquake so destructive and deadly?
Well, it was a bigger earthquake than this part of Morocco is used to. It was also relatively shallow. It was between 10 and 20 kilometres below the surface. And if the earthquake had been the same size but deeper down, the shaking at the surface would have been less intense and fewer buildings would have collapsed. But it was an exceptionally big earthquake for this region. It's a long way from the plate boundary. The fundamental reason for the earthquake is Europe and Africa are colliding. And the boundary between the plates is more or less through the Mediterranean. So here in the high Atlas Mountains, we're 300 or 400 kilometres south of that main plate boundary, but there's still earth movements. That's why the mountains are there. So something let rip, and there was a big earthquake.
Do you get the impression that authorities were prepared for this at all?
No, but they were not as well prepared as, for example, they were in Turkey with the big earthquakes we had over the winter, because Morocco is not such a seismically active area. The buildings that have collapsed are very old buildings, certainly not built to standards we would try to build to today to make buildings seismically resilient. But on the other hand, these mosques you've seen pictures of that are damaged have been stood there for hundreds of years without receiving any earthquake damage. It's not a region which has many large earthquakes. There was a big one in Agadir on the coast in 1960, which caused some damage, but this is much the biggest one we've had in this part of Morocco for well over 100 years. So, but they hadn't built to withstand earthquakes. They don't need to because the earthquakes are so infrequent.
Exactly. I mean, still on that, is it even possible to prepare for an earthquake of this scale, whether in Morocco or anywhere?
Well, you can build. We're going to have to rebuild a lot of places. Will they find the money and the willpower to spend 10% extra on the building costs to make structures that are more resilient and will not shake down in an earthquake? I have my doubts. I don't suppose they will. It's a poor country. It's hard to find resources. They will build with local materials. But on the other hand, the buildings that have fallen down are hundreds of years old. If they build again, they will probably last another several hundred years before the next big earthquake. So it's a very difficult choice you're faced with. Do you take the risk and know that every few hundred years a lot of people will be killed? Or do you spend a lot of money to make buildings that don't fall down?
I mean, there's been a lot of recent disasters regarding earthquakes, landslides, the whole lot. Why does it seem so difficult to predict such events?
Well, we know where earthquakes will happen. The South Anatolian Fault in Turkey, we know it's moving, and you should build seismically resistant structures along there. But we don't know quite when the earthquakes will happen. In Morocco, we know it is prone to earthquakes, but they're much less frequent. So there's much less local preparation. But the point about earthquakes, wherever they are, is that pressures build up and up and up, and you don't quite know when it's going to give way. So we know the earthquake-prone zones, but getting a year's or a month's or even a day's warning is pretty much impossible in most cases, because it's just random when the last little piece of resistance is overcome and the earth snaps.
Right. David Rothery, Professor of Planetary Geosciences, thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Let's now bring in Caroline Holtz. She's the Director of Disaster, Climate and Crisis at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. She joins me from Geneva in Switzerland. Hello, Caroline. How challenging is it for aid organizations responding to this earthquake?
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. Your pictures tell a story, of course. We can see for ourselves how complicated it is. This is still very much a search and rescue operation. And those stories of hope, of people being pulled out from the rubble, still alive, is what keeps us going at this time. But we know that the window is small, and we know that this really is a race against time. Accessing these people, both in the cities but also in those more remote locations, is proving extremely challenging. Road and transportation routes, communication routes, electricity, all of those are disrupted in an event the size of this earthquake. And that is creating frustration and chaos and confusion on the ground with regard to the response.
I mean, you mentioned yourself, the epicenter of this quake was in a very remote area. So how can help get through to the people living there?
It's a case of bringing in heavy machinery in order that we can clear those roads, that we can clear the rubble to be able to access those people. But of course, the communities themselves will be the first responders. We can see there hundreds of people, dozens of people at least, with putting their hands to the rock and really starting to shift it. The challenge is here, of course, it's an extremely dangerous time. The aftershocks will continue, and many buildings that were destabilized but didn't necessarily fall in the original shock may well destabilize further, and it's still an extremely dangerous environment for those people to be working in.
As rescue efforts continue, what are the coming weeks and months going to look like for people in Morocco? Because it looks like this is the start of a very long process of recovery, isn't it?
Yes, as I say, for the next few days, we can expect that the search and rescue window will continue, but unfortunately that does start to draw to a close, probably middle of the week. It's also important that we look after those that survived. There are many people living outside now, exposed to the elements, many of them with injuries. Be that severe injuries, severe head wounds, broken bones. And we're trying to triage and make sure that those cases are prioritized so that the worst cases are receiving medical attention. But again, as we saw, there's a lot of makeshift first aid that is very necessary just to cope with the volume here. We will also then see that people need shelter, as I say, to keep them from the elements. They'll need water, they'll need food. And also, we shouldn't underestimate the need for psychosocial support here. The mental trauma of an event such as this one is huge. And really, the Moroccan Red Crescent, who's our partner on the ground, is really supporting the Moroccan government with many of these elements. Then we will move, of course, into longer-term recovery, but that's further down the road at this point.
Caroline Holtz from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you.